And thank you all for showing up today. I'm going to talk about my sabbatical project, the exhibition that's across the hall in the University Art Gallery. Hope everybody gets a chance to see it. Hope everybody gets a chance to enjoy the reception following this talk today. Meter Reader, Voltage, Amperage, and Knowledge. I'm going to talk about how I inherited a grand slew of mid-century analog voltmeters and ammeters and realized I am an artist. I need to do something with this trove that I inherited. Professor Chiata suggested that I should start talking a little bit about how my education brought me to my current interests, or where I was when I came out of college. And if we do our job right, which we do, students come out excited, feeling their power, feeling their fire, feeling their skills, diverse skills that they'd developed in hard work in our classes, but also a bit confused because they're 22, 23 and wondering, okay, well, like a superhero, what do I do with my powers? How do I do good? So at 22, I came out of Dartmouth College, where I'd had beginning drawing class of still life, landscape, and figure, intermediate drawing class, still life, landscape, and figure, painting classes of still life and figure, but also realized I need to find what do I have to say. 2 teachers, one in person and one in print, helped lead me there. And this was, in a semester, I took a winter semester off because I didn't like the New Hampshire woods in winter. I came back to Michigan and spent a semester studying with the muralist John Onye Lockhart in Ann Arbor. And then a year later, studied further with him and did intense figure drawing, very realistic, very well-rounded. His imagery is notable, very Afrocentric from Black history. Masterful murals in the Manoogian Center at Wayne State University that I hope everybody gets to see. A nice response to Diego Rivera's of a generation before. But I realized, well, I'm really impressed and struck by this work, but I'm not African American. I shouldn't necessarily be the one expressing this. Another scholar that impressed me was in print, John Berger, the English critic of art and literature. And he wrote about the moment of Cubism around 1900, all the optimism with the new century, innovations in the sciences, political pressure and organizations claiming their right, and just a real sense of optimism. Well, I just came out of college in the 70s and I thought, I want to be optimistic. Maybe I should pick up Cubism. So, thinking about what should I be expressing, I realized I'd been a student all my life. Maybe I should start with that, which I know. So I worked from old junior high school yearbooks, some from my own class, some from other classes, and realized the power, the freedom I could feel as an artist to rethink form, manipulate form, have bodies flowing into each other, boundaries breaking down, flatness of some parts, radical abstraction of some parts, but realism, roundedness of other parts, the realism I learned from Lockhart. And so I started thriving, having fun, finding myself in this body of work. I took images of the modern dance class and these young women feeling the power of their own bodies, and realized I could have the negative space behind the leg cover over the leg, disappear part of it entirely. I could have parts of the body fully rounded or abstracted into just shapes, or I could have other parts defined only by a sinuous line. So, power of the artist was what I was feeling as a young man, and it's a good thing. I want all our students to feel something similar. The basketball team had fun with their faces and their different faces, and working from photographs, noticing how European American faces flatten out in a flash bulb, but often have, you get nice, rounded, light moving on darker complexions. So I had fun with that, and the different kinds of representation. So the power of the young artist, or any artist, to choose representation. Musicians that were playing at a supper club in Ann Arbor in the 60s, Sounds of Tomorrow, wore checkered sport coats. So I jammed on that checker motif and carried it through. I realized I could abstract political content as well. This one on the right is entitled Police Captain Reads Court Order Banning Further Demonstrations. I think it was at University of Michigan. There's a big down jacket on the table next to a shiny leather chair. I think you can get a glimpse of light on the policeman's helmet and visor. So all these things, content can be abstracted in different kinds of form. And that, for me, made a more interesting political art than had I just been representing it realistically. Okay, murals. I've always liked painting on walls. I began in high school. The view in the upper left is what you would see from a toilet stall in the house I lived in college. I painted that fantasia upon the ceiling. There's a caricature of the stuffy head of the art department among those cherubs. And I took that. I decided I wanted to get out of Michigan, which isn't really strange for someone in their 20s, and went to San Francisco, fell in with the community murals scene there, and got commissions to paint in a housing project and to work with a school, the Club Latino of a Catholic school, developing their ideas. A workshop representing different San Francisco types as astrological signs, which was suggested by one of the students in the workshop, and we developed it. And then there's a scene in the lower right. I had a private commission to do a moonscape upon this for the ceiling of a casino in Jackpot, Nevada. So someday I've got to hit Jackpot, Nevada and see if that's still up there. Now, I thought painting was all very well and good, but if I wanted to be taken seriously, maybe I needed to go to graduate school. San Francisco State had some photorealists that I had been interested in since high school, Bob Bechtel and Richard McLean. And so I thought I'd go study with them. I quickly realized I wasn't a photorealist. My interest in photography was just to bring me cool stuff, interesting stuff, passionate stuff, like the conflicts in Central America from around the world. I didn't really want to replicate the photograph, treat it as seriously as they did. So I did a project, as I said, it was concerned with the struggles in Central America and called it Varieties of Political Experience. And you see the two leaders of Grenada after there was a U.S. invasion and coup, and they were brought into custody, being guarded. And you see Central American revolutionaries juxtaposed with some picture of a girls' volleyball team and Hunter, probably from some sports magazine. So again, treating these things playfully, eclectically, and mixing, just seeing what happens, but also painting passionately. These were on paper, 5 foot by 9 foot, sometimes 13 feet. You got a little glimpse of the studio that I had painting the moonscape. So was able to work very big. And when I'd have to go across town to San Francisco State to show my paintings, while my fellow classmates were renting trucks for their big canvases, I would just roll them all up, tuck them under my arm, climb on the bus. So climb on the bus, was able to live cheaply, didn't have college debt, which I'm so sorry our students now suffer under, and it limits their choices. So there was a sense of freedom, and I tried to make the best of it and grow as I could. Now, while I was in grad school in the painting program, one of my professors, Sherry Rossetti, she was a fan of a mural I'd just done about a neighborhood baseball team in the 1930s. And this was a couple blocks from my studio. There had been a Pacific Coast League team, and there, 50 years before that, had been an amusement park with bear pits, fighting bears, and all sorts of other eccentric P.T. Barnum era amusements for the working folk. So I juxtaposed those into this mural. And Professor Rossetti had gotten a call from the sheriff's department, a sheriff deputy in San Francisco. And she asked if there was anybody who did murals. So she said, Mike, do you want to do this for credit this next semester? And so I did a whole cycle, 4 walls, a room about this size, in the visitors area of San Francisco County Jail number 2. And I noticed the biggest obstacle was communication. People were stuck behind bars, having a hard time interacting with their family, maintaining family contact. This man is talking to his son behind a very thick glass partition. So I emphasized the twists and turns of communication. There was the prisoners who were in for felonies had orange jumpsuits, whereas those in for misdemeanors had white t-shirts and pants. But I don't know if you can see in the upper left of the mural, the jail mural, they're all dreaming of women, impossible women. That's what they spent their time talking about. Now, murals kind of went belly up for me for a variety of reasons. Politics and community art, I'm shocked. In the mid-'80s. So I was trying to find something else. One of my radical friends, Fred, said, well, Mike, I've been writing these videos that teach electronics down at a community college south of San Francisco. They need a graphic designer. And part of the reason I think you should take it is they say they're going to try to switch to computer graphics after this project. And that was a new, burgeoning, strange field at that time. And I thought, get paid to learn computer graphics? I'm down with that. So I undertook drawing these various circuits carefully with ink and press type. But all of a sudden, it reminded me of the first drawings I had ever seen. My dad with a number 2 pencil doing engineering problems on white typewriter style paper when I was a child. So I immediately fell into this idea of circuitry and started, of course, since I mine everything from my fine arts in life, I started plugging it into paintings and having circuitry linking pseudo-classical figures and sometimes putting in a bronze leaf in some of them to make them more heroic. You'll see that gleaming in some of the paintings in the gallery. And so the electronics motif felt good and fed me. I also started doing computer paintings on the computer, the Lumina paint system on a PC, and went back to my trusted high school motifs. And then in this one with some 19th century robber barons, the circuitry linking them. Okay, my degree from San Francisco State wasn't an MFA because the university hadn't been certified at that point, but they got certification, so I went back to investigate. And they said, well, Mike, rather than painting, you know, our conceptual design program, which involves computer art literacy, might be more interesting to you or might reflect the work you're showing us, your recent work you've been doing. And I was actually working for Apple at the time, and so I thought, well, this could be interesting. And I had actually taken the course as an undergraduate. It was very exciting. There's a high degree of intellectualism, very smart people running it. Brian Rogers on the right, who at the end of his career was the dean of the University of Michigan Art and Design College, and Stephen Wilson on the left, who's written several books on art and science interactions, which we've got in Zano Library. Very much encourage students to investigate. So I entered that program for 2 more years to get an MFA, and Brian's wife was a graphic designer. She had gotten me a job, this was, I guess, before I was at Apple, is doing graphics for the Science Museum, the Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And they had wanted cartoon illustrations in the style of a comic book for a show about lightning, big lightning bolts, and signage in red and blue, like an old Captain Marvel comic of the 1930s. So I'd done that. Brian said to me, Mike, what are you going to do for your thesis of your culminating project in this program? And I said, well, I had so much fun at the Science Museum, I think I'm going to do a Science Museum of the Self. So I did this autobiographical installation called the Self-Referentium, and bronze leaf letters above it go through all these explanations of myself, my vices. My liver is in the shape of Ireland. But you notice my heart is in the shape of Michigan. There was a little interactive squeeze bottle. You could smell what my breath smelled like with a cigar butt in there. So I played with this idea of autobiography up on the walls. And that automobile you see in the front is another student's work. She had texts written all over the car body. So I got my Master's of Fine Arts in the Conceptual Design program, now called Conceptual Information Arts, because Steve Wilson wanted the initials to be CIA. So I was excited about what I'd been learning at Apple. There was a product called HyperCard that was used to put together interactive information, hypertext, with the vision of Ted Nelson in the 1960s of interactivity upon the screen. And so I thought that was a good medium for this hybrid of text and graphics, kind of like a comic book, that could be displayed on screen. At the time, computer art at conferences like ISEA was too often an ugly beige box with a screen. And I didn't think the world needed an ugly beige box. I thought the world needed good community murals. So I thought of these things as these kiosks I created as almost like fragments of the murals, which are now technologically becoming possible. I want to get my hands on the toys of massive touch screens that look like painted imagery of James Brown or Daniel Webster, or an interactive mural of musicians. But once you touch them, you can manipulate the information. You can get further levels of information. So that's the kind of thing I was waving my hand about in the 90s and predicting. And as I said, the technology is now coming to fruition. Unfortunately, too often it's flashing billboards along I-75, but that should be in the hands. It should be in our hands soon enough. Okay, I began teaching here in 2000, and some of you may have attended some of my exhibitions I've had since then in Michigan. In 2002 at Studio 23 in Bay City, I showed some of those big paintings on paper. In 2008, I had the work of a previous thesis called Visual Engineering, but everything was touched by the Afghan and Iraq war. I was so troubled that we were in a state of war that even if I was trying to use imagery of strippers from Detroit, there was, refugees popping up in it, just because this was what was inevitably on my mind. So all the work had war in it at that point. The Saginaw Art Museum, when they had groups of artists showing, I had about 15 pieces, but they suggested I do art installation like I had been doing, done a couple previously, that had scratch and sniff perfume strips in them. And so I did a painted wall called The Smell of Jobs. And it included various imagery of musicians. Question Mark and Dick Wagner are up there. It had church choirs, factories, Theodore Retke, some musicians, local musicians. It was fun seeing the bass player, the musician Donnie Zuzula's little daughter sniffing her father's foot on the wall, but they were all perfumed. I was working to perfume Saginaw. And I showed some of my old work as well as recent work at Creative 360. And currently, I'm doing some work that I plan to show at Counterculture in the summer regarding the shooting of Milton Hall, Saginaw's unfortunate entry into the Black Lives Matters issues. And that will be the 5th anniversary of his shooting by 7 police. So the meters, what am I going to do with all these meters? How do I approach it? I convinced the university that this would be a good sabbatical topic. Now I want to make good. They basically say, show us what you got. And so I like to make use of a sabbatical. I like my job, but I like it when they pay me to stay away. So thought came. At that time, I had this work from my 2008 series at Scene Metrospace in East Lansing that was painted upon a found canvas, like furniture store seascape that I had added imagery, circuitry, and some collaged elements. So I thought maybe I should begin with found canvases. I had this big found canvas. This is about 6.5 feet. And I don't have it in this show, so I included it in this. You're going to see some things that didn't make the cut, that weren't really successful enough to be exhibited here. So I added meters to it, actually physically attached a meter as well. The painting was kind of falling out of the frame, so I caulked it around the edge, which my wife said was a big mistake. So I took her word for it, didn't include it. One that was more successful, however, was a Van Gogh print that had been left by a tenant in house we own. And so I put some meters in that, put some figures in that, collaged in some pictures from an automotive magazine of some engines to add some shininess to it. And that worked a little better. You'll see it across the hall. I also took advantage of the fact that we live a block from a little grocery and package store where people will buy lottery tickets and they'll walk a block and be in front of our house by the time they realize this is a loser. So I find these tickets on the lawn. I collaged group of them, soaked them in water so they were nice and soft, and glued them upon a board, and then added a meter and some leads, some circuitry, some impossible circuitry. I put schematics in the leads of the meter. I have no respect for the rules of electronics. I make the rules. I make the physics, and then added a figure. In this case, the figure is based on our neighbor, who's a tattoo artist, and this kind of rotund individual who'll be outside shirtless, and his body covered in these sort of heavy metal, satanic, death, screaming, flaming skull tattoos, stuff all over his body. So I referenced those in the figure. And I shouldn't call him a loser, he's a nice guy. I had done a sketch of a piece regarding the composer Leroy Anderson. Leroy Anderson was a teenage friend of my father's. And I said, well, Dad, did you ever have a band with him, or did Leroy have a band, a jazz band in the 1920s that you would go see? And he said, no, we just hung out. Okay. But anyway, I had thought of this piece kind of like an ancient Herm, the sculptures of Pan, and that would be in a garden or something in classical times. And I thought of it with meters, a meter in the heart, a meter in the gut, and a typewriter, since he wrote the famous typewriter song. And I then learned that my friend David Swain, who has the band, the 251 Orchestra in Ann Arbor, was devoting an evening to Anderson's music. And I thought, well, this gives me reason to put this thing together, and I'll exhibit it there. And so I did. And so that's the Leroy Meter Herm, as the band plays Leroy Anderson's classics. Okay, I started painting on big pieces of styrofoam, which are a real staple of sculpture classes at this university, and one can find scrap pieces easily. So I liked the thickness of them. I liked them almost like fragments of old frescoes. You know, they're probably fragments that came down in the earthquake in Italy that are in stone, that have the thickness of these pieces. So started playing with a meter as a crossbow, a meter as a snowmobile. Snowmobiles were a motif that amused us when they first came out when we were in high school. So I continue, you'll see them pop up in some of my paintings. And as I put these up on my studio wall, they reminded me of Catholic boyhood, where there were stations of the cross, little bas-reliefs of different moments from the process of Christ's crucifixion, the Passion. So I started mapping some of these to those moments. And I didn't do the full complement of them, but about a half dozen of them. So you'll notice the titles of them they're arranged together in the gallery. So this was one direction I took. On the sabbatical, I took several directions. So there are several small bodies of work that you'll see in the gallery. And you can decide if the degree of unity or the degree of difference between them. I started doing some things, sort of conceptual photographic pieces, though I think they were less successful. And the idea of a holy picture with the head being the meter itself. One friend of mine, while my father was the engineer, I became the artist. His father was a poet, so he became a computer scientist. We talk about our fathers. He asked me about if I had any Simpson meters. So I thought of the Simpsons, Homer Simpson and his brat son Bart. And so I did a couple pieces that referenced the Simpsons with a Simpson meter. There was one piece I did where an undergarment of my wife's was hanging up, and I put a meter in front of it and thought it looked almost like an aquatic animal or something. So these pieces didn't go very far, but I gave them a try. I gave them a shot, though they didn't enter into the gallery show. So I'm showing you some sort of different directions, maybe dead ends. However, I realized I was also hitting on my big themes with some pieces. This one, meter, fish, woman, that's in the show, I realized was carrying forth things I'd done in paintings previously, a couple years before. So to reiterate my big issues, the flatness that photography, I believe, pushes imagery towards versus roundedness. I know students like to draw from photographs, but I believe photographs push students towards graphic design, towards flattening, simplifying just areas of light and dark rather than roundness, unless there's a conscious process to work through, reconstruct figures and get roundness. Somebody jokes that every arty kid of my generation in junior high was drawing pictures of Jim Morrison of the Doors with half his face in shadow because that appeared on a popular record album. So there, as I said, that kind of flatness that photography pushes one towards. The whole question of life, the body, exuberance, the erotic, versus machinery, precision, science, as it's defined, STEM classes. Is that a dialectic? Is that an antithesis that needs to be resolved? Those are two different directions. I like to have work that has both within it, a meter and a figure. This woman with the fish and a saw sharpener. So the idea of timelessness versus technology. Is there something classical? Is there a classical or even global about the figure? That we all have bodies. We all are men or women. So that eternal verity versus the latest machinery or things that really locate it in our time or reference a previous time, like the old meters. So that's something that is an interesting conflict to be resolved. And then the whole thing of boundaries between the figure and the space, between the figure and the ground. All of that is something formal that remains very interesting. And some artists focus entirely on that, but for me, that's just one aspect. That's a formal aspect that needs to be resolved with the content, and the need to make my content work it in an interesting way. So, I realized that some of my work that I had set aside could be enlivened, reinvigorated by the addition of a meter. So I put one in this cubist image, which is actually based on a basketball team, a women's basketball team downstate celebrating a victory. I added a meter in bronze leaf to this little boy jumping out of a window. And so the meter became, the meat of the soup, and created something that had been stalled previously. Sometimes I did pieces that, as I said, I call follies, that I would have a couple of scopes. In this case, they were from a catalog of scientific equipment and figures. As I said, I'll see these ads in Detroit entertainment papers and stuff, and I'll just think, wow, I have to have her in an artwork. So would add that, and this one has a hookah in it as well, and an 18th century horseman. Sometimes I'll just put these things together to see if they click. And if they don't deeply, they'll sometimes at least have enough coherence that I'll say, okay, I'll add this piece to my exhibitable pile. Also, the figure and drawing. When I was teaching 122 intermediate drawing, would always, every time I have a model in class, I do demo drawings as well. how cool is my job? If I'm ever stuck what to do, I draw in front of my students. It's just making use of having a model, and the models aren't nude, but I just kind of often leave off the clothes and will juxtapose them with meters or with mid-century equipment devices, and link them together with the eccentric circuitry or the meter leads. Now, as a reader of John Berger, I realize how freighted in Western art history the nude is. Can it be reclaimed, or is it invariably sexist? I hope not. I think that my view hopefully is not restricted to the traditional collector of 19th century nude paintings or something. I believe that the other artwork from around the world of the figure, notably Africa, all should resurrect the use of the figure, the essential figure. So I hope that proceeds in a progressive direction. And also noticed I labeled it Heroes because I really like, I believe youth, athleticism are good things. And I really like using, people from the volleyball team or baseball team as models in class rather than older bodies, because that becomes suddenly a woman holding a spear-like thing becomes the huntress Diana. So I believe contemporary students should see themselves in those heroic traditions. Now, when I'm not encouraging students to draw very carefully from observation, I also believe in impulsive drawing with liquid medium, what I kind of call Zen in ink. The idea of working off the Asian tradition of meditation upon a subject, a single flower or something, then a quick move of drawing it with a brush and ink on rice paper, no erasing, no mistakes, just this is your result of the moment. I like to draw that way as well and have for many years. And I did a series of 44 meters in one day that I have exhibited on the wall, across the hall in the gallery. Now, you could ask, how long did it take you to do it? Well, it obviously took me decades to get to the place that I could do it. I also made use of something else I inherited besides the physical meters, boxes of my father's notes, his notes for problems he would assign his classes at University of Michigan, engineering classes, notes, tax returns, figuring out his consulting, how much money he'd made, etc. Just a lot of notes in his hand, and also old handouts, Fall 1956, EE 360 handouts, often dittoed in that delicious purple blue ink. And I thought, well, this is something else I have to process, make use of. So I did drawings and then also photocopy prints, multiples, on what I call Mosher paper, which is this relic, the paper that he left. So I'm actually, inscribing my work upon my father's work. How psychologically strange is that? Somebody should certainly get a thesis out of that. Finally, beyond the material, the virtual, because of issues postponing the exhibition of my thesis work last year, I had all this work, but I hadn't exhibited it. However, last summer I gave a TED Talk. We had TED Talks here. And at the end of it, I was waving my arms about virtual reality. I was so excited about it years ago when it was clunky, when it was creaky, when you needed computers under the table as long as a row of tables in this room to make it happen. But now the technology has caught up, and it's wonderful. And at the end of the talk, Professor Corser, who'd organized the TED Talk, said, well, Mike, we've got students here who are developing VR. You should meet them. Maybe they'll want to work with you. And so these guys said, yeah, we'll work with you. What do you want to do? And so in my humility, I said, men, build me a mighty museum. And so off they went, Kelly and Kevin, and they came back and said, okay, well, we have a question. Did you want polished granite for these walls, or did you want veined Italian marble? And it's like, so they took my work and put it on the walls of what we call the Mosheram. And they hadn't seen the artwork, they'd only seen JPEGs. So pieces that were only 14 inches suddenly became 14 feet or more on the wall as they, as curators, decided. And created all nice effects with light and clear story windows, 30 feet up, whatever. And a corridor lined with the ink drawings you'd walk through between buildings of the Mosheram Museum complex. And a temple dedicated to the feminine principle that had burning, they used a lot of properties from video games that had, burning pots of pitch in front of them, so on, all very, very imposing. Pieces blown up to mural size. One enters the temple by passing through the face of a meter. And they said, well, how about a bookstore? You should have a bookstore here. And I work with the Comics Artists Club on campus, the SVSU Comic Strippers. So I said, no, we need a comic book store instead. So the Mosheram, which you should be able to see on a walkthrough on the DVD player in the gallery, but you can also see online on YouTube. If you can't find it on YouTube, email me. I'll send you the link. It has a comic store with not only my comics on the wall, but imagery by the students in the class. So it's the idea of the technology, the virtual reality, moving back to a community experience, moving back to something as richly involving multiple stakeholders, multiple players, as the mural with the kids in the Catholic school Latino club years ago. All of these things, move back, continually enrich my art process and keep it exciting for me. So, as I said, students should come out both feeling their power, a little bit confused. Like my dad, in his university teaching career, I'm a little bit confused about what kind of art I should be doing next, how to be doing best possible thing. A little bit confused by university politics, but continuing my work, continuing the kind of work that I began back in the day in college. So I want to thank all who have supported my thesis, my sabbatical work. Thesis work before that, but the sabbatical which produced the work you'll see in the gallery now. And I also want to thank you all for coming today. Hope you enjoy the show and the reception as well. Thank you.